So this past October, actually, was able to buy my first car in Oklahoma City here in college, and I found a pretty good deal on a Mazda SUV on Facebook Marketplace. I went to go check it out with a buddy of mine, and we went to kind of this private dealership to go check out this car. And after checking it out, decided that it was one of the cars that I wanted. I decided to pay the car with all cash, but I had one problem, that I didn't have a bank in Oklahoma. I'm a Wells Fargo person, and the nearest Wells Fargo from Oklahoma City was in Texas, so it was about 3 hours away. And at the time, I didn't have enough cash to pay for the car all itself. So I called a bunch of the banks around the neighborhood, Chase, and a bunch of other things. And long story short, they didn't allow me to withdraw cash without starting up a new account, which I didn't really want to do at the time, except for this one place called Western Union, which happened to be in a Walmart. And if you know anything about Walmart in Oklahoma City, if you think, Walmart here in San Leandro is pretty sketchy, the one in Oklahoma City is probably 10 times more sketchy than the one here on Davis Street. And long story short, I get up to the counter here at the Walmart, and keep in mind, this is one of the storefronts in front of all the cashiers and where people are checking out, right? And long story short, I was able to withdraw about $5,000 from this Western Union. And you're probably thinking right now, bad idea. And at this time, I wasn't thinking about it, but I thought, I need the money, and I need it right now so I could pay for the car. To make things worse, as the teller gathered all the cash from that thing that moves a lot, she takes the wad of cash and places it on the counter in front of the glass counter where all the people are standing in line to wait to get their cash, places it on the counter and counts out loud $100 bill at a time. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And this whole time I'm trying to maybe stand up, look a little bigger so that people behind me didn't see all the cash that she was giving me. And at the end, she handed me the huge wad of cash. And I'm like, do you have an envelope that I could put this in, or do I just take that? And she's like, oh yeah, I'll give you an envelope. So she gave me that envelope, and looking back at this situation, definitely should not have done that. I took the risk of withdrawing that massive amount of cash at Walmart because, I wanted the car right away, and I figured, Walmart was 5 minutes away from the dealership, and all I needed to do was grab the cash, get into the parking lot, get into my friend's car in the parking lot, and go over and buy the car. And that was a risk that I took, and definitely not a good risk that I took looking back. A risk is a situation involving exposure to danger. People take risks all the time. Professional sports players take risks, risk injuries, and sometimes death playing sports. Investors take risks. Oftentimes, we are okay with taking risks that involves ourselves, whether the good outweighs the bad or even vice versa, because it affects ourselves. But when it comes to taking risks for the sake of others, we tend to be more apprehensive because, number one, it benefits others and not ourselves. And number two, if it fails, it doesn't really affect them, but it more affects us. And the question I want to ask you is, when's the last time you took the risk for others? Or even more important, when's the last time you took a risk for God? Epaphroditus, we see in our passage, was a person who risked his life in order to serve Paul, even to the point of death. So why was Epaphroditus able to stay faithful even to the point of death? In Philippians here, Paul emphasizes the need for unity in the church and having the mind of Christ, we see in chapter 2. Both the need collectively as a church and also individually to put the needs of others ahead of ourselves. It's what God wants us to do, and it's what God says he will help us to do, to put the needs of others ahead of ourselves. And Epaphroditus, he was someone in the Bible who shows up twice in the book of Philippians, once here in chapter 2 and once in chapter 4. And it's likely that Epaphroditus could have been the pastor of the church of Philippi prior to going and visiting Paul. So having the mind of Christ means to care for others rather than ourselves. And Paul told us, and Christ is a perfect example of this, Paul. And Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, he thinks of the church. And, well, you say, that's what preachers are supposed to do, right? That's what pastors are supposed to do. They're supposed to think of others. They're supposed to care for others. And that's true. That's 100% true. You're 100% correct. Pastors ought to think of others. But for the health of the church, this just can't be limited to the pastor. It can't just be limited to the church leadership. It has to be every single member. And we see in here in our passage, verse 25, that Paul writes to the church of Philippi from prison. And this prison or jail was not like any state or federal prison that we have today, where all the prisoners' needs are taken care of. There were not well-kept facilities. There were no meals provided, no workout room or gyms provided for the inmates. It was up to the person's family members or the people that they knew to provide food, clothes, or help if they needed it. And this is exactly what Epaphroditus was doing on behalf of Paul. And we're here in verse 25, and Paul is sending Epaphroditus back from the prison because the church found out that he got extremely sick in the process. And it is mentioned 3 times in our passage that Epaphroditus was sick unto death. And it mentions twice that he nearly died. Moving on in verse 25, we see, just notice the words that Paul uses to describe Epaphroditus. He says in verse 25 here, a brother. Even though Paul wasn't an apostle, he didn't think Epaphroditus any lower than him. He considered him, someone as a brother. A companion in labor simply means a fellow worker in the ministry. And then a fellow soldier. It's the idea of someone fighting alongside you in battle. Someone, Paul says, that fought with me in the trenches. He's not only a brother, a fellow laborer, but someone who is with me in conflict, Paul says. Someone who's with me in war. And then lastly, a messenger. And this is the word that just simply meant, a preacher, a teacher. And this was also a word used to describe Barnabas and Timothy. And then in verse 26, we also see that he was a caring individual. In verse 26, it says that he longed for the church and was full of heaviness. Long simply means distressed. He was in great distress for the church because they worried about his sickness. So Paul is saying, I am sending you back so that you can show them, Epaphroditus, that you're okay, so that you could show the church that you're okay. Because Epaphroditus was concerned that the church was concerned for him. And what that simply means is illustration that I could think of is, if you have ever went to go intentionally to visit maybe a loved one who was in the hospital, and before you could get the words out to express your care for them and ask them, before you can tell them anything, they expressed how much they care for you and how your family is doing and how you're doing and how your kids are doing, right? And that's exactly how Epaphroditus, what kind of man Epaphroditus was. He was someone who was concerned that they were concerned for them. And then notice God's mercy he had on Epaphroditus, verse 27. It says that Paul said that Epaphroditus was sick to the point of death, but God spared his life. And Epaphroditus went as far even to death, but God, as far as death, to serve Paul. So I ask you tonight, how far are you willing to serve Christ? How far are you willing to go to serve Christ? And later on, Paul is saying, not only was God merciful to Epaphroditus by sparing his life, but he was also merciful to me, because if he would have died serving me, I would have had sorrows upon sorrows. And then verse 29, it says, receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, Paul says in verse 29, and hold such in reputation. Paul commends Epaphroditus and says to the church in Philippi, this is someone who's honorable. This is someone who's commendable, someone who's respectable, someone who puts others first in the ministry. And then notice this, that the Bible says he was nigh unto death because the work of Christ, not regarding his life. The phrase not regarding his life simply means that he had no concern for his life. He risked his life, and he exposed himself to danger by serving Paul in this way. And what I see here is that Epaphroditus did not serve Christ in a self-protected mode. I believe he knew that going to Rome to go visit Paul was going to be dangerous, but he also knew that it was God's will. And he did not go into a self-protected mode. So we ask the question, how was Epaphroditus able to stay faithful despite this? How was he able to stay faithful even to the point of death? Epaphroditus was able to stay faithful even to the point of death because he realized, we see in verse 30, that the work of Christ was far more important than his own life. And today we can stay faithful to the ministry even to the point of death if we realize that the work of Christ is far more important than our own lives. And we need to be willing to put down our own needs and our own comforts aside in order for us to do what God wants us to do. Not everyone is called to full-time ministry, but everyone is called to do the work of Christ. And I'm thankful for all the men and women who have risked their lives to go where the gospel has not gone. I'm thankful for the men who have risked their lives and have surrendered to the call to preach. Those who have perhaps chose to live comfortable lives to serve others. God has called us to be willing to take risks for him, whether it be the call to the mission field or even to the call to full-time ministry. However, today, I know I'm speaking to the church here, and God may have not called you to serve in full-time ministry. So you ask, how does this apply to me? Well, we see in this passage, and we see in Philippians, that God commends those who live for others, those who live for others rather than themselves. And we can honor God and do the work of Christ by helping others. And Epaphroditus was a character, as we saw, who set his own desires aside to serve others. And remember that God honors those who help others. So we can honor God by helping others even when we're busy. Anyone busy here? I don't know, this semester I've been extremely busy. An opportunity arises for you to help someone. But you think, if I help them, I'll be this much further to being behind. Are you willing to risk giving up your time and use it to help someone else? Are you willing to put the needs of others ahead of yourselves? This past semester, I was given an opportunity to be a resident advisor at Heartland, just one of the authorities in the dorm. And one of the things is I get the opportunity to serve the guys in the dorm. But this past semester, there's these two guys who didn't have vehicles but worked off campus. And these two guys, always at the most inconvenient times, would always ask for rides to work. And since I had a car this year, I was responsible for trying to help find rides for them or to even give rides. And God just showed me, are you willing to put the needs of others ahead of yourselves and drive them to work, even when they asked you right last minute and not any time before? And God showed me that today, this past semester. God honors those who help others, even when there are dishes still to be clean and need to put away, and everyone else gone to watch TV or go to their room. But God honors those even when there are dishes to be put away. I don't know. I'm there. And that's something that God taught me, even this past few years, putting the needs of others ahead of yourselves. God honors those who try to help others, even when you have multiple meetings and all kinds of demands that you have to meet. But then you need to meet with that one person, the person that you rather not meet with, but you need to put the needs of others ahead of yourself. How about when you ask someone how their day was? And then they begin to tell you how their day was. That's happened multiple times to me this past year. You just meant it to say hi, how was your day, as in hi, but, they begin to tell you how their day was. Rather than seeing them next time down the hall and then trying to avoid them, how about giving them the time of day for them to talk to you? Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself? How about when you have to deal with someone difficult? Anyone ever have to deal with someone difficult? Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself? Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself, even when someone doesn't show up to work, and you have to cover for them, and they said you're sick, but they're actually not sick. You just saw them yesterday. Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself in that area? Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself, even when no one seems to notice that you're serving, when you serve others, when you don't get that good job, or when you don't get that well done, when you fill in for that extra nursery shift, or the extra cleaning position at church? God knows when you put the needs of others ahead of yourselves, and he's honored by that. Those who are in public school, those who are in universities, or even in your workplaces, are you willing to take the risks of being disliked or even rejected by standing up for what you believe there? And then lastly, can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself, even when you've been praying for that someone to get saved, or that someone to get right with the Lord, or that child who needs to get right with the Lord? Can you put the needs of others ahead of yourself and just keep praying for that person? Epaphroditus remained faithful even to the point of death, because he realized that the work of Christ was far more important than his own life. And we need some Christians today. We need some church members today. We need some youth today. We need some parents today that will put the needs of others ahead of themselves and realize that the work of Christ is far more important than our own lives. And we can often be so selfish, so self-centered, and so focused on ourselves that we forget how important it is to do the work of Christ. So I ask you today, can you put the needs of others ahead of yourselves?